Welcome back to the next episode of TMT with Mike O'Reilly. My guest, Mark Jamison, and I want to get your title right. Dr. J to most everyone out there, but I want to get your title because it's pretty extensive here. Non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, as well as the director and Gerald Gunter Professor of the Public Utility Research Center at the University of Florida's Warrington College of Business. Did I get that right?
That's all correct, which tells you I really can't hold a job well, so I get lots of titles.
Well, maybe that's a good place to start. Can you give us a little bit of your background? What got you to this point in your roles at the University of Florida and at AEI?
Well, I grew up on a farm in Kansas. And back when I was growing up, dinner time conversations were always about business decisions. They were about international trade issues, which affected our farm. Monetary issues affected our farm. Regulatory issues affected our farm. And when I got to college and found out I could study all those things, and they were called economics. And it involved mathematics, which I really liked math. That was just a natural fit for me. So I jumped into that as a profession. And from there, it was just fair along the way that people would watch me do something. I like what you just did. Let's open this door. And that has been my career. I got to the University of Florida because it called me to help do something because they knew me. I got to AEI because someone at AEI saw me do something and said, I'd like to have you on my team. So that's how my career progressed.
So in your current roles, what's a day in the life of Dr. J? I know you're a prolific writer and commentator. What incorporates your typical day or typical week?
I have three basic kinds of days. One is that I direct the research center, so I'm focusing sometimes on what are our strategies? Who are we in the world? What do we really value? And how do we make a living doing those things? So that's one day will be like that. Another will be spending a lot of time talking with people on Zoom calls, etc., just about research topics we have going on, different projects we have going on. So that will be another one. But then I'll have days where I'm just writing and reading and trying to understand things. I'm very much a researcher at heart. That's my nature. And so I'll have days that I forget to eat lunch. I forget about everything else except what I'm working on.
Part of your role at the University of Florida and doing research is spreading the regulatory or should I say the light regulatory approach worldwide. And you, in effect, if I in our interactions, you help train regulators globally. What's your view of how the rest of the world views what's happening in the United States in terms of regulatory obligations on communications providers? How do they view that today? And do they have differing opinions?
Well, let me explain a little bit of what we do in that space. So our research center has a course on regulation that we put on twice a year. We've done this since 1997. That's what brought me to the university to help launch that course. That course covers how do we actually conduct regulation on telecommunications. Now we call it more ICT, on energy, on water as well. So it's kind of the infrastructure industries. And in that, we're largely international. We've had over 4,000 people now from 160 countries. Our emphasis in that is always helping those people be the experts, the world-class experts that their countries need. So we're not telling them what to do. We're telling them, here are the basic principles that apply. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what sectors you're working with, here are the basic principles. You have to be the expert that says, here's how I do this in my country, because every country is different. And I struggle enough to know what in the world should happen in the United States, let alone what happens in another country. So that's always our emphasis. And so we're not spreading an idea of a particular solution, but how do we understand? And then how do we pivot when things are different or things change, or we've learned that idea didn't work so well. So we don't find a lot of people actually looking to us as U.S. experts. We don't see people looking to us to tell them what goes on in the U.S. When I travel around the world or talk with people, they view me more as their professor than as an expert in something in particular. So that's our emphasis, is how do we help them to do that? The conversation doesn't turn very often to what's going on in the U.S. They'll want to ask questions maybe about some energy policy issues in the U.S. They'll ask questions about water. They don't ask many questions about technology issues or telecommunications issues. And I think that's easy to understand, because if you look at what we are doing in that space, it's evolved from a fairly unique governance structure that we have of states and federal government, and that relationship and sometimes lack of relationship between the two. That shaped a lot of what's there. And then our industry history. No other country has that. And so they don't ask what did the US do very much, but maybe what have you learned? And that'll be more what the conversations are like.
Well, turning back domestically and federally, one of the messages from the U.S. government for a good number of decades has been a separation between the regulatory bodies and the political apparatus in both domestically, and then spreading that message internationally. Where do you fall on the recent conversation or evolution, I guess I would say, about the Federal Communications Commission? What is your views on how that should be approached?
I learned about regulatory independence when I stepped outside the US. So I'd worked in regulation on the state side for many years, then went to work for industry before I ended up at the university. When I ended up at the university, that's when I stepped out and started walking around the world and seeing how else things were done. And that's when I learned how important regulatory independence is. When you don't have it, it's very noticeable that you don't have it. So this idea, what are we talking about with regulatory independence? The way I explain it to people is you have two basic worlds going on. You have a political world where its planning horizon is no longer than the next election. That's how far they look, and that politics looks into the future. And it's not that we have bad politicians, that's the way we vote. So that's the world we've created. An industry has 10, 20, sometimes even 30-year planning horizons. And for them to be able to do that well, for the industry to be able to do that well, it needs to have some stability, some predictability of what the rules are going to be like after the next election, and after the next election, and after the next election. And so that's why we put in these independent regulatory commissions. We have a political world that's very high tension. We have a business world that is also very high tension. They don't mix together very well, so we put a regulator between them. It's a difficult life because neither side likes what you do. They want you to do what they want, but you're there to be a stabilizing force. And so I learned that that's really important. That was backed up by some really, really good research by a couple of Nobel laureates and a few other people as well. Douglas North, Oliver Williamson really helped us crystallize what do we mean by a regulatory what do we mean by regulatory independence? Why is it important? And so I think about in terms of how does that work well? What does it take for that to work well? It is there primarily for that providing stability for business planning. But that's important only if you're trying to control what the business does. And so when I think about the US today, we've largely stepped away from that utility model in telecommunications. We don't have that anymore. We don't have a situation where we need a regulator playing the role of a competitive marketplace. We have a competitive marketplace already. And so I don't think that we actually need that kind of an independent regulatory agency, at least on the telecommunications side. Broadcasting is a different story. There, as I understand it, as I've studied the history, we have broadcast licensing in an independent regulatory agency, largely because, one, radio spectrum is tough, it's difficult to manage. Congress didn't want to have to do that. So there was those technical issues of control. But then again, we were licensing broadcasters. The government isn't to have a role in what broadcasters say. And so having an independent commission mattered there as well. But we're also now in a world where everybody's a broadcaster. And so, do we really need that for that particular role as well? That's a good question to have.
If in the world you just described, do we still need an FCC, or does it mean that we could add more political structure on top of the existing FCC? Would you eliminate it, or would you merge it with other entities in the federal government?
Well, there are some roles that the FCC plays today that I would do away with. One is the regulation of what we call the common carriers. Common carrier came back from centuries ago when people were hauling things from one village to another, and there was only one entity that would do it. And if that person with the wagon didn't like you, you were in real trouble. So courts in a common law system developed this concept of common carrier, and we've carried that for a long time. Now it's embedded in our laws. I don't think we really need that for telecommunications. So for that, we don't need that role. I don't see why we need broadcast licensing, radio spectrum licensing, of course, but it's different to say you have a license to use radio spectrum and you have a license to speak these kinds of things. That's a different kind of a role. So I don't think we need that either. But once we do away with those two roles, we've also taken away our need for an independent regulatory agency. So we could easily move a lot of these functions, maybe over at NTIA or someplace else that has where you can really have a lot of good experts. And that is a direction I would tend to take things. But let me just emphasize that this regulatory expertise is critical. If you read the debates of 120 some odd years ago when people were forming regulatory commissions, expertise and political independence were hand in hand in those debates. And we still need all that expertise. So we need a place for it. I just don't think that we need that arm's length relationship to the politics anymore.
You started to talk about this and really want to delve a little bit deeper about regulatory burdens. Do you think that the obligations on what I'll call traditional providers or legacy providers, whether they be in the telecom world or in the broadcast field, make any sense any longer? And then how does that correspond with the regulatory free universe that a lot of non-governed entities face?
So let me just change the question just a little bit from the regulatory burden to, for the businesses, do we want to have the opportunity for someone to come in and add a burden hanging over their head? Because we have seen when we have changes in who's in the White House, the emphasis, the types of regulations you will see on telecommunications or other industries just change a lot. And if you're trying to build a successful business, if you're trying to be world class, and we are in these industries, at least today, then you can't have a government that every 4 years changes its mind almost completely on how it's going to treat you. So I think in terms of what kinds of boundaries do we need on the government so that it doesn't step in and change the rules dramatically. And that's why I think in terms of let's remove that opportunity for the common carrier regulations. Let's remove that opportunity on telling broadcasters what they can and cannot say so that those businesses can plan according to what the customers want, what the investors are willing to invest in, and what the employees are willing to work on.
Much of that would require changing current law. We just happen to be a couple months removed from the 30th anniversary of the Telecommunications Act in 1996, and there's been a conversation: should we rewrite the 96 Act or the 34 Act? What's your take on that? And you fundamentally talked about two segments there where Congress would need to alter that. What's your view on a rewrite of communication law?
Yeah, I think that is something that Congress does need to do. I think it needs to remove the regulation of those two types of industries that I talked about, because those two types of industries really don't exist anymore. It's spread across a lot of different types of players, those different types of markets and activities. So I think Congress needs to step in and say, okay, it was great. We worked really hard at it, did some things well, did some things poorly. That's life. Now we need to step out of that space. So I'd like to see Congress do that and then rationalize where else we have those kinds of functions that the FCC does. You could still have a federal communications agency if you wanted to. You could roll it into NTIA. Probably either system would work well. People in both of those agencies get a lot of respect around the world. And so I don't think that it's necessary to change those a lot. That would just be a matter of convenience, I think.
Do you worry that the legislative process may fall the other direction and start to capture companies, industry segments, and likewise that are not governed today, some of those that have been flourishing successfully in the marketplace?
That's always a concern. It's always a concern that Congress will try to regulate things it should not regulate. We have a lot of discussion. We've had it for a long number of years now. Should Congress develop rules on app stores? Well, we've had that debate. It's still going on, and app stores are starting to change into something else. So that's a lesson for Congress, is that when something looks important and urgent in these industries, you just wait a few years and it'll have gone away. It's all going to be different. So yeah, I worry about what Congress might do, but that's our process. We live with our mistakes that Congress might make.
What's your take on what can only be described as the communications subsidy programs that are out there, whether they be the direct programs such as BEAD or the direct and indirect aspects of the Universal Service Fund? How do you see those operating, and are they a necessity any longer?
I'm fairly skeptical of those programs from a lot of experiences I've had over the several decades of being involved with them. I won't go into all the stories because, well, some of them are kind of embarrassing, and they'll probably bore a lot of people. So I won't go down that road, except that to understand that almost all of that framework that we use came from a time in which telecom companies were monopolies. And there was a lot of give and take on who gathered what money from customers and who then received the money and who got to spend it and what they got to spend it on. That's where this whole mindset comes from, is that world. We've still not let go of that. As I think about it, I wonder, why do we treat it differently than we do any other kind of assistance for low income? When we calculate how much support we want to give to low income households, the costs for telecommunications, broadband, etc., are already in there. If more is needed, we can up it there, but it should be their discretion as to what they spend it on. I wouldn't see a special program for that. And then with respect to the infrastructure, we have lots of situations where rural infrastructure, high cost infrastructure needs some sort of financial support. We have other mechanisms for that. Like I said earlier, I grew up on a farm. And for my first 15 years, we didn't have running water. My father and a bunch of other farmers got together and got a loan from the USDA, built the water system, and that worked. It worked quite well. So we can have programs like that that provide financial support. In fact, if you look at the development of telecommunications, there were two times when telecommunications grew really fast in this country. The first time was when AT&T's patents expired and it had to start competing with the independent companies. Telecommunications just exploded with that competition. Then things settled down, monopolies were formed, and growth leveled out. The other big explosion is when we started giving loans to rural people in rural areas to develop telecom companies. That was the other explosion. So we could learn from that and use that kind of system.
Do we have a world today where we have subsidy programs that are competing with each other? You can get you get financing under BEAD. You can still get money under USDA loans you just spoke about.
Mm-hmm.
They still exist. You can get money under the Universal Service Fund. You can, depending on what you're doing, you can overlap, and you find that you can be competing in an area that may be really economically troubled and having 2 or 3 different subsidy programs competing against each other. Is that sustainable?
Well, we can sustain a lot of things that don't make a lot of sense. We're quite good at that. But it's certainly not a good use of taxpayers' money. I agree on that. I don't know what the count is now. Last time I counted, we had like 100 different broadband subsidy programs, just at the federal level, let alone at the state level. And certainly those don't all work well together. In some sense, yeah, the programs kind of compete against each other, but they're often in conflict with each other. One of the things that really troubled me when we started the BEAD program was that you were a commissioner at the FCC. back before when you set up some programs for rural areas. And it was hard to do because you didn't have a lot of money to do it. So you designed a program that could build over a long period of time. And then Congress stepped in and put something else that, well, in a sense, competed with it, but it certainly didn't work well with it. I think we could just narrow it down to maybe one program, or the federal program plus some state programs. That would be fine too. But the different entities of the federal government having different types of planning horizons, different types of constraints, certainly have not served us well.
Let's turn the topic a little bit. Over ever so recently, the issue of broadcast content regulation has resurfaced and been an hotly debated topic. Why do you think that is? What has generated the resurgence of broadcast content regulation?
All public speech is political. And if you're a political actor, you don't want people saying things that contradict with what you want people to hear. And so it's almost impossible for a political actor to stay out of that business. And in the day when, for technology constraint reasons, we could only have a few people serve as broadcasters, it made sense to have licenses for that. It made sense also to try and keep the political fingers out of it as much as we could. But now we're in a world where, like I said earlier, everyone's a broadcaster now. And that we still have the special licenses is just an opportunity for the political actors to try to influence what is said. And that doesn't serve us well. So that's one thing that I would just take away the mechanism. And then I think we'd be better off.
So, if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting this public interest standard that we impose on broadcasters doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. If everyone is able to be a broadcaster, then a segment of the population is that a fair?
That's fair because, yeah, how does the public define public interest? It's by who they choose to listen to. They've got lots of choices now. So they're defining what is public interest. I don't know why we would have people in Washington, as brilliant as people here are, trying to figure out what is in the public interest in someplace in Kansas where I grew up.
Does the government have a role in influencing that conversation, even if it's not going to, have the direct regulatory burden on a company? People call it jawboning or kind of manipulation, or call it. Is there a function to try and steer for government to kind of steer, or so that should be something left to the private marketplace, as you indicate? Lots of competitors, lots of voices, lots of opportunity.
In every other way that people speak, people govern their own speech, except when you step across what's allowed under the First Amendment. You can't directly threaten in particular ways. That's not allowed. But everything else, people are able in the marketplace of ideas to have the competition. I don't know why, when it goes over a radio wave, that we would treat it differently. Not today. There was a time when maybe that made sense because there were only a few people could do it, but that's not so true anymore.
Over the last couple of years, maybe a couple of decades now, there's been a debate over whether we needed or how we should govern the mergers of a couple companies, select companies in particular, and whether we need, for lack of a better word, double regulation, double review from both the FCC and DOJ. Sometimes it's an FTC DOJ, depending on which market segment you're looking at. What's your view on whether the merger process should be altered going forward?
I don't see a role for a Federal Communications Commission in regulating mergers. And I'm not sure that we ever really needed that. It was there for transference of licenses, but since we already have all the customers expressing what is in the public interest, I don't know that we need, for as brilliant as FCC commissioners are, them trying to figure out what is in the public interest in Miami County, Kansas, where I grew up, or someplace in Colorado or Utah or even Virginia. It's all of those people are quite capable of making up their own minds. And I just don't see a reason for a public interest standard in transferring a license.
there's been criticism of the antitrust side of the equation and DOJ's role in recent mergers, some that have been approved and some that have been rejected. If you think of Sprint and the burdens that they asked, Sprint, T-Mobile, the burdens DOJ asked on the commission, they weren't on the commission side, they were on the DOJ side. Or if you look at Spirit Airlines and what just happened in its bankruptcy and the previous administration rejection of its merger with another low-cost carrier. Does antitrust law and antitrust review have enough, to actually get those right?
Well, we get them wrong a lot, because we're always looking into the future. But actually, we're just looking in a rearview mirror, because we only know of the past, and we don't know it very well. None of us are good at projecting the future. So lots of mistakes are made. And so one thing I guess I would like to point out in that context is that there are some myths about antitrust and especially mergers that are really broadly accepted, but we really should correct them. One is that our enforcement on mergers has weakened over the years. That is a conventional wisdom. It's a story that's told over and over again. But when you actually look at the numbers, and there was research published about a year ago where they looked at numbers of how did companies respond to merger reviews, how did the courts respond, how did the regulatory agencies respond, so we can figure out what's really going on. And we find out that actually merger review has gotten tougher ever since the Chicago school stepped into it. They actually strengthened merger review by making it more rigorous, I guess. I'm not sure why, we just know it got stronger. And then there's also the idea that the mergers that have been allowed have decreased innovation and they've decreased competition. But again, there are some recent studies that show just the opposite is true. The mergers have indeed, in general, triggered more innovation. And that kind of makes sense because you've got one company with these talents, another with these talents. They put them together, they can do something that neither of them could do before. And so you actually will get greater innovations out of it. Not all the time, but sometimes you do. And we actually end up with more competition oftentimes. The most recent study just came out about 2 months ago, looked at the effects on competition. Well, it looked at market competition and how it's changed over the past 30 years, found out it has actually increased, and that mergers had no impact on it whatsoever.
Interesting. So part of your work or your recent work in following your writings, you've been engaging extensively on the issue of artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think the federal government should do, if anything, on regulating or governing the development of artificial intelligence from the so many different layers, but say from the algorithm side to now we're hearing of a new executive order coming out that's going to have a kind of a preview process between any new development that's put forward. What is your take on the government's involvement in artificial intelligence?
I don't know what the rumors are about what might be coming out. What I try to help people understand or recall is that artificial intelligence is just advanced mathematics. We're using advanced mathematics to predict things. And sometimes we predict well, sometimes we don't. The only question is, when we've used a prediction, has there been a negative consequence on someone? And we already have laws that take care of those kinds of things. If I use bad materials when I make a product, or if I use deceitful advertising when I sell a product, I am liable for that. If I use bad math, I should be liable too. But regulation of mathematics doesn't strike me as a really good idea for the government. If nothing else, just because it all changes so fast. The European Union tried to pick up the regulation of artificial intelligence a few years ago. They had an AI Act. And during their years of implementation, they had to change the definition several times, because the world moves way too fast to try and say, I'm going to control what mathematical algorithms you can use in making your products. We can tell people that if this is a medical device, you need to be really careful with materials, with your math, with everything else you do. Always, always, always be careful. There's really high liability if you make a mistake. But telling them, oh, you can only use these types of molecules, or you can only use these types of algorithms, I just don't think we can do that well.
What's your take on the individual states engaging in this? I know your state of Florida has been involved in this process, and the governor's been very active. It seems to not be moving forward at the current moment. But what's your take on whether you view AI as an interstate matter? It certainly requires in many instances, the communications network to function in many instances. Where do you fall in that conversation?
So there are three things that I try to keep in mind in this space, and they're mostly lessons learned of what's going on. One is I have a set of students that have been doing a lot of research on AI regulation at the state level. And what they've discovered is that most of the state activity is about the state regulating itself on its use of artificial intelligence, making sure it's a good customer, a good user of AI. And I think that's really important. Every company has to be careful with its governance of how it uses these technologies. Governments have to do that as well. And then when they worry about consumers, they've done a reasonable job of worrying about consumer impacts. Whether it was AI or not, you can't impact people this way without their permission. And they've done a reasonable job with that. I would caution states from going any farther than that. And that's the same thing I apply then to the federal government. With respect to what I think about it being interstate versus intrastate, I try to keep in mind that AI is it's kind of like a device or a material you use in making a product. It by itself is neither state nor interstate. The product is either sold intrastate commerce, or it's sold interstate. And that is where I think the regulation would occur. What are the liabilities and properties? What's allowed for products, not the inputs of the products?
What are your views on AI if you were to look out? We talked earlier, prognosticating is very difficult.
Yeah.
But do you have a dystopian view of what AI may become? There's a number of naysayers and views on what may happen with AI, and then there's also the other side of the equation where people have full faith in what AI may solve. The world, the cosmic's biggest problems that we faced, and lead to new generations of medicines and all kinds of technological innovation. Where do you fall in the scheme of range of views?
Well, this is where I really don't know. We've been very good over the years, over the centuries, at creating new ideas and applying them, and those that didn't work fell by the wayside. Those that worked, we continued and built upon. That's how we've always changed and evolved as humans. In this particular situation, things are moving really, really fast. And so maybe we don't adapt as fast as we should, but there's no putting the genie back in the bottle. When Mr. Musk several years ago said we need to put a pause on AI research, I thought, well, good luck. You've got a lot of graduate students going to sit in their basements doing this anyway, all across the world. You can't stop that. So the question is, how do you help all of us adapt fast when we need to adapt? I don't think we've solved that yet, but we have to learn, and we have to learn how to adapt in a really fast-moving world.
Does AI present a concern that it may point out all of our flaws? You've got a new model out there that's been, the company Anthropic has been very careful in terms of how it, but if it highlights and is able to quickly show the flaws in whether it's security or many different facets, that could be problematic. Does that raise concerns to you, or is it like that's part of life? You can invent a better vault, and someone may figure that out, and we'll have to go from there.
One of the lessons I always remember is from the sort of the invention, but actually the production of the automobile. When Henry Ford made the cars available for everybody, the FBI did a study, and it said, look, a lot of the number of bank robberies has really ramped up. We wonder why. And it was because cars became affordable. And that is our moment we have here as well. AI is about prediction. And you have agentic AI, which is about acting on the prediction as well. We can now do that more cheaply than ever before. And we'll make a lot of mistakes in doing that. The question will be, how do we respond to the business opportunity of using AI to help us respond quickly to AI? It'll reveal things about us that maybe we all won't always like. I'm glad we learned them.
Last question, I promise. When you look back upon your career, extensive career in this field, do you think that the regulatory universe has gotten better or worse? Are we learning from the lessons that we've and mistakes we've made in the past, or are we replicating them, or are we creating new ones? How do you envision, when you step away from the field, is it gonna, do you feel like accomplished, or is it, boy, we're still just as dumb as we were before?
Well, we're still humans, and we sometimes learn, and sometimes we don't. The broader view of, is regulation better or worse than it used to be? I'm pleased that we've adapted in many situations. Unhappy with our lack of adaptation in some, but I'm one person, and that's our system. Our system, it says, well, Jamison, you've got your opinions, but you're an academic. Go back to your office and work on your computer. That's the way our world works, and I'm very happy that it has that kind of adaptive system to it. In terms of what do we learn, what do we not learn? It's incumbent upon all of us, and this, hats off to you for the conversations you're holding, because you help people learn. You help people remember lessons from the past. I won't name the institution, but I had a conversation with an institution, a big international institution, just recently, talking about some of the challenges that they are trying to address in the world. And I told them, I had this same conversation 30 years ago with people from this institution, and here's the work that they did. The people I was speaking with in this moment knew nothing about that work. We forgot, sometimes we just completely forget history. And so the work that you're doing is really important, so that we learn from these things. Because if you think of us and our evolution in biological terms, our advances are made by building on. When we forget, then we've got to try and recover. And that's not as great of progress.
Well, you're doing great work, and I can't thank you enough so much for your time.
Pleasure.
And really appreciate your insight. Thank you so very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.